Welcome. I'm Carl Frederick, and I will be interviewing individuals for Kenosha Voices, an oral history project of the Kenosha County Historical Society in conjunction with Kenosha Community Media. I have worked in newspapers for more than 40 years as an editor and a reporter. 38 and a half of those years were at the Kenosha News. I am also a member of the Kenosha County Historical Society Board. We hope you enjoy these programs. I'm speaking with Peter Barca, Department of Revenue Secretary. Thank you for joining me today.
Well, thank you, Carl. Great to be here.
Okay, let's talk about your public service history, your interest in serving the public, being running for office. When did you become first interested in public service?
I would say probably a couple years out of college. I had directed a camp called the Friendship Camp, and so I had a real passion for people with disabilities and trying to make sure that we provided opportunities for them. And I taught with John Collins and Frida Shirk. I taught children with emotional disturbance as well. And they were very politically active, and both Frida and John, we're talking politics all the time. Whenever we got together outside of work, and so it caught my attention. I always, from middle school or junior high, as we used to call it, through high school, I always took a big interest in history and civics and things of that sort. So I had an interest to begin with, and then Joe Andrea had asked me to be on his campaign committee. So between Frida, John, and Joe Andrea, they probably played the biggest influence in getting me to be involved in the political process.
Okay, so the first socially conscious job, so to speak, was the Friendship Camp.
Yes, that's right.
What was that, actually?
That was a camp that we had out in Kenosha County. It was a day camp for children with disabilities, and it was, as I recall, an 8-week camp, and kids would come out in the morning and via bus and stay there from like 9 in the morning till about 3 o'clock, and then be bused home. And we had all kinds of activities for them, everything from swimming and boating and ball type games. You'd throw the ball, and coordination activities and arts and crafts and singing. And the thing that was so remarkable to me is I had never worked with people with disabilities, and being a typical teenager, you're kind of focused on kind of your own sports activities and things of that sort. And so it really did prick my conscience, thinking, my goodness, I guess I got to really be focused on how we can help other people. And it was a magical environment in many ways. The reason why I say that is that when children are in an outdoor environment, they kind of lose their inhibitions. So we had children walk for the first time, talk for the first time. So it just was such a feeling of joy all the time to work there. I would have paid them to work there. I couldn't believe they actually paid me.
How long did you work with the camp?
I was here, I believe, for 11 summers. I started right after I graduated high school as a junior counselor and became a senior counselor, the assistant director under Steve Frank and Tim Fulton, and then I became the director after they left.
Okay, and after you were, while you were involved with Friendship Camp, you were also involved in other ways, either with socially conscious or teaching.
Right.
What did you do?
Well, I during that period, I went to college, got a degree, came back, worked, in the special education unit for Kenosha Unified. I became the head of a day treatment facility for severely, emotionally disturbed individuals and children with emotional disturbance. And then I got very involved in community groups, like a juvenile justice reform type project. Many of the kids I work with would get in trouble with the law. I became involved in economic development types of activities. Mayor Bellotti was elected during this period, and he put me on his legislative committee. So I just found that I was getting more and more involved. I joined the United Way. I helped to raise money for the United Way campaigns. And so I think it was sort of a natural progression. I just became more and more involved, and eventually thought when Joe Andrea decided to run for the state senate, a number of people suggested you ought to consider it. A lot of people on his campaign committee where I served, and I thought, well, why not? I have some ideas here I'd like to push.
So you hadn't really initially considered public office as much as advancing issues that you were interested in.
That's right.
And what were those issues?
Well, issues, like, providing more opportunities for, kids with disabilities, juvenile justice reform, to try to help young children who are in trouble, to give them opportunities to turn their life around. The United Way, which, did so many wonderful things for nonprofit organizations, whether it's like the Kenosha Achievement Center or Hospice Alliance, or other programs for elderly people. And then I got involved in our economic development for Kenosha. I grew up in the town of Summers, and but being in Kenosha County, it's my first love. I'll lived here all my life. I'll retire here, and so I care deeply about our community and just got more and more involved.
Okay, and what year was it that you ran for assembly?
In 1984, Joe Andrea decided he would run for the Senate after John Maurer retired. And so with encouragement from my friends, I decided I'll go for it. And there was an 8-way primary, so there were a lot of people that ran in the primary. And then there was a Republican that ran as well, who later became a good friend of mine. An independent, Tony Machete, ran as well, and who I became friends with later in life as well. And so, it was a good, solid campaign. And I think I was still learning while I was out there campaigning, but I love meeting people. I love talking to people. So going and knocking on doors and going to community events came naturally to me.
Okay, and how long did you serve in the assembly?
I served in the assembly. I was elected to a 5th term when Les Aspin decided to take a position with President Clinton as the Secretary of Defense. And then once again, with the encouragement, a lot of my colleagues in the legislature, they said, you ought to run for Congress. And so I did that, and I won the 1st Congressional District then, back in 1993.
Okay, and how long did you serve in Congress?
There I served just 1 term, and then I had the closest contested race in the country, and I lost for the first time and only time in my career. It was a tough year for Democrats. It was the biggest landslide against Democrats, I think, in probably 50 years. It was a landslide of 1994. Which was probably matched in 2010. Fortunately, I didn't lose a seat during that period, but I know some people that lost both. It's like being hit by lightning twice in your life, I think, for people like Ted Strickland, who was a friend of mine, who lost in 94 and then lost as governor back in 2010. And then President Clinton had tapped me and asked me if I would join his administration. And so I initially took a position in charge of the Midwest for the Small Business Administration. And that came naturally to me because both my parents were entrepreneurs. I had worked in both their businesses. I knew someday I'd own a business, which I eventually did. And so I'm a big believer in small business and entrepreneurship and the good it can cause in society. And so I learned a tremendous amount. I traveled throughout the Midwest in the 10 offices that I oversaw in the Midwest, and it was a great opportunity. And then when Senator Kit Bond, a Republican, joined with Democratic President Clinton and passed the Small Business Regulatory Enforcement and Fairness, I became the first national director of that office, or national ombudsman.
What was that office again?
It was called the Regulatory Fairness Commission.
And its purpose?
And its purpose was to try and make sure that federal regulatory agencies were more small business friendly. So to help them comply with the law, and if they created minor violations, not to really hit them with heavy-handed fines, but to instead, give them a warning and help them to comply. So the goal was to enhance compliance and also to help small businesses, so that we were working in partnership with them to be more of a facilitator than a heavy-handed regulator. And I love that job as well. That came naturally to me, and we, I think, accomplished some good things.
What were your big issues while you served in the Assembly and in Congress for that 1 term?
Mm-hmm.
What were the things you were most interested in trying to accomplish?
Yeah, well, I would say a couple things. First of all, I believe very strongly in economic development, and I had a lot of ideas about utilizing University of Wisconsin to partner with businesses to help them to grow and expand. I passed an entrepreneurial support bill. Obviously, for people with disabilities, I was very big in championing special education. And with Edith Simons, who was a strong Kenoshan, who is someone that worked tirelessly. We passed a bill for telecommunications for people who were deaf. So that was something we were very proud of. I work with Mary Iverson, another great Kenoshan who played a great role in helping to champion a bill that we passed to have deferred utilities, so that when you had urban sprawl where they were building subdivisions, 10 miles outside an urban area, and farmers had to pay for the utilities that went past their farm, even though they weren't going to get any immediate benefit, we passed a bill so they could defer it until they developed their farm, if they ever develop in the future. And then I think of Ed O'Macari, another great Kenoshan, who we helped pass creating the Veterans Cemetery out there in Racine County in Union Grove. So I work very closely with citizens and community groups here to try and champion bills that were important for our community. And then later in the Assembly and in the Congress, when I represented Kenosha and Racine and even Beloit, Janesville, Lake Geneva, we just always had projects that kind of focused on community development, economic growth, and looking out for those that needed more help. People who are, infirm, elderly people and people with disabilities. So those are sort of the touchstones of things I always focused on: workforce development, things of that sort.
How was the working relationship between Democrats and Republicans in the Assembly when you served those 5 terms?
Well, my first tenure in the legislature, it was extremely close. Democrats controlled everything when I was there. At first, you had Governor Earl, they controlled both houses. Then Governor Thompson came along. So you had a Republican governor, but you still had a Democratic legislature. And we worked very closely with Governor Thompson. He was a good friend of Kenosha, and we accomplished a great deal, even on a bipartisan basis. I can remember virtually all the key bills I put forward. I always get Republican authors. Probably my proudest moment was when we finally got a majority in both houses, almost an equal number of Democrats and Republicans, to force the transferability of credits from the technical college to the university. Well, then finally the university, who was reluctant to accept technical college credits, kind of waved the white flag and said, okay, we'll do it. Please don't pass a bill. Let us have some flexibility. And so I worked closely with them during that period, and it's nice to see the kind of growth that ensued following that.
Okay. Then after you, let's go back to your term in Congress.
Yes.
How was that between Republicans and Democrats?
It was good to a degree. I mean, obviously, you have Bob Michaels was a minority leader, a Republican from central Illinois, and he and I would end up flying back to O'Hare Field oftentimes when I couldn't catch the Midwest Express flight to Milwaukee. And so I got to know him, just a true gentleman. But you had Newt Gingrich in the horizon, who was, who deposed him, and felt Republicans had to take a tougher stand on things, and so you could see it starting to erode a little bit during that period, which is unfortunate. But they were still very positive. I worked closely with Ron Brown on enterprise zone legislation, with Secretary Riley from the Department of Education on a number of initiatives dealing with like apprenticeship and for people with disabilities. And so I was able to keep working on the issues I cared about. And so I was just thrilled then when President Clinton asked me to join his administration on something I care about, economic development and helping small businesses.
Okay, how long did you serve as Midwest Director of Small Business Administration?
Well, total almost 5 years. It was about 4.5 years, and in the Clinton administration, I left about 6 months before the end of the administration. I was recruited to be the CEO of a employment and training type firm and rehabilitation for a group called North Point Resources, right across the border. And so that was something I once again, it brought me back to sort of the roots of working with people and helping people to get jobs and have better training, and also work with people with disabilities. So.
And how long were you involved with North Point Resources?
I was here for 3 years, and then a group called Aurora Associates International that I eventually bought the company with 4 partners, but I started as a vice president in charge of our projects in Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, and they take me because of the employment and training expertise. They had a couple projects and they had lost their expert in that field. So I started doing consulting with them. I went to Vietnam to work with the 10 largest employment and training firms as they were moving to more of a free market type economy. They needed to really revamp what they were doing. And so then the group asked me to join them as a vice president. And then, I don't know, after about 5, 6, 7 years, we put together a group when the two founders from 25 years earlier decided to retire. And we bought the company.
Okay, so tell me about some of the programs. You mentioned Vietnam and that is the project where they're working toward a market economy and how you helped establish that program. What other programs or places that you could tell me a little bit about?
Sure.
Where you worked?
Well, we had a very large mine safety project in India. We did a lot of occupational safety and health type projects. We had one in Bangladesh. We had quite a few in Latin America. I did not oversee those. Those were overseen by Gundu Rao, who was our program director. But then we had a number of projects in South Africa. We have one in the IT arena where we put in cables to connect public health authorities with rural school districts so they could get records on immunization and health type records, things of that sort. We did some education, employment, and training in South Africa as well. And I worked in Central Asia. I headed a project which normally as vice president I oversaw them, but didn't actually have the technical side. But in this project, it was a project for the World Bank dealing with the business enabling environment, where Tajikistan was trying to attract more foreign capital and trying to have more partnerships between their companies and other companies. And so we were looking at some of the factors that were inhibiting growth in that country. So, I worked then one last one being the Ukraine. I did a couple projects there, and that's why it just breaks my heart to see what's going on in that country now with the conflict that Russia started with the Ukraine.
Okay, and you mentioned mine safety in India. Just what did that project accomplish?
We worked with a number of their large coal mines, and we brought in experts really from MSHA, the Mine Safety Administration that we have here in America, to bring modern techniques to mining in India, but also occupational safety and health. One of our proudest achievements was in one particular mine, they were having a very high incidence of heart attacks amongst workers. So we did a very careful study, and we found out that part of it was after they ended up working their day, they'd have to take a tram up. So they would have to walk up a steep embankment to catch a tram. And oftentimes they'd sit down and drink cold water, and it was not healthy for their heart. So we changed that protocol and really cut the incidence of heart attack amongst miners dramatically in this particular mine, which was a demonstration project which they then implemented elsewhere too, as I understand.
And how about Bangladesh? What was that project?
Bangladesh was trying to bring in occupational safety and health standards. Mainly we work with the American AmCham, American Chamber of Commerce, British Chamber of Commerce, to work with Western countries that were contracting with businesses in Bangladesh. And a woman named Charlotte Grove, who was a really tough woman, she would go toe-to-toe with these executives and tell them how important it was that they institute safety standards. And we had some pretty good success working with a number of companies. But I have to say, not universally effective. There were a number of companies that just they just said, well, we have too much going on, and it's a 3-year project, and they just kept putting us off until we finally, the project had ended and we didn't have any more funding. But we did work with a lot of companies, and I think brought a lot of, just new innovations to protect workers.
And how long were you involved with Aurora Associates International?
Well over a decade. I think we had bought the company after I'd been there about 7 years, and then when I came back in the legislature, kind of through a fluke, it was sort of a last-minute decision to run, and so then I did both for my first 2 years, but then after the landslide of 2010, where the speaker, majority leader lost, they asked me to be the minority leader, and then I just couldn't possibly do both. So we sold it to a sister company, and we've got some of our people still working there actually, so it's good.
Okay, so this second time in the legislature, how was the working relationship at that time, which is about 20 years after
Right.
your first terms in the assembly?
It was strained. There's no question about it. When I came back, I was kind of startled, quite frankly. It seemed like people didn't like each other even. And then, of course, in my second, so the Democrats were in charge in my first term of both the Assembly, the Senate, and Governor Doyle was there. Well, Governor Doyle didn't run again, and Governor Walker won. And then Act 10 came along, and that produced just really the most acrimony I had ever seen in the legislature. It was really a very hostile kind of environment. So then 2 years later, Robin Voss ran for Speaker. Speaker Fitzgerald had left, and he and I had always had a pretty cordial relationship, and which fostered into us really getting along and developing a friendship. And we brought forward a memorandum of understanding to change the rules by mutual agreement to try and bring back comity, not the laughter type, but comity, where people could work together. And it worked well. Then we formed like different study committees on a bipartisan basis. So where we could work together, and of course we don't agree on everything, but nobody ever does, but on those areas where there was commonality, on some apprenticeships and other projects of that sort, we brought forward legislation and I think made a difference. So I was happy that we moved the needle somewhat. It's still not nirvana. It still isn't like it was in my first tenure in the legislature, but it is much better. And I've been very fortunate because I've had a very constructive working relationship with the Republicans who have been in the majority since 2010. And so it's helped me, I think, in the Department of Revenue to pass about 5 different bills on a very bipartisan basis.
So during your second terms, this second time around in the Assembly, and the discussion and the being able to work with Speaker Voss, what kinds of bills do you remember passing with bipartisan agreement?
Support? Sure.
Yes.
Well, I'll tell you one that I was very, very pleased with, and I worked with Pat Strakota, who ironically became the majority leader. So it worked out well because then she had a little bit more authority to help move things. But really, I would credit the press to a large degree helping us to pass the oral chemotherapy bill. That was during a period when oral chemotherapy was becoming more popular, where people with cancer, as opposed to having to go in and sit in a medical facility with, for an hour to have, the traditional chemotherapy, that, for those that had medication available, that we would make that to be a level playing field so that financially, they could make a choice without having to spend significantly more for oral chemotherapy. So that was a real plus. And, growing up in the town of Somers, now the village of Somers, but they were growing rapidly, and we passed a TIF provision for them to help them with some major development that they had underway, and the speaker, being from Racine County, was willing to support that, as did Governor Walker too, frankly. So it was nice to be able to get that through the legislature. And there were a variety of other bills that dealt with economic development that we were able to get through. I served on ever since the start of the Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation, I served on that board almost continuously for the last 11 years.
Okay, and how long did you then serve in the Assembly this second time around?
I served 5 terms in the Assembly, and then I was reelected to my 6th term, and I had the shortest tenure ever because I resigned after 45 minutes when the governor asked me to be a Secretary of Revenue. Okay. And that's when Tim McGuire, who had worked for me before, ran for the legislature and was able to win that seat.
Okay, so tell me about the Department of Revenue position. How does that fit with your issues of children with disabilities, the elderly, economic development, job training? How does the Department of Revenue job fit into that?
Yeah, remarkably, Carl, even better than I would have expected. So we have a research and policy division, and we have, all the macroeconomists, or most of the macroeconomists for the state that project where the economy is going, and what it looks like economically for making investments. So we started a program we call Badger, Business Development Government Relations. And then we took it out on the road, and we've had meetings. I was there in Edgerton last night. I was in Racine, I think a month ago, with the Racine County Economic Development Corporation. And I travel with our economists, and we share economic data to help businesses to make, good decisions and to have a sense of where the economy is going. And then we put on our website what we call visualizations. If anybody Googles Wisconsin Department of Revenue, VIZ for visualizations, they get all kinds of economic data. And then even with our income sales and excise department, we started a small business outreach program to help new businesses to understand what they had to do to comply with tax laws and to get seller's permits, things like that, so that they wouldn't have to be bothered with making mistakes and having to repeat themselves. And then we've tried to train people to be more small business sensitive. That oftentimes when you'll settle with a big corporation because they have an army of attorneys, we're saying try to give the same kind of a consideration to small businesses, even though they don't have an army of attorneys. And so we've made an effort to try and be much more small business sensitive. And of course, the lottery is almost like an enterprise into itself. And I call that our entertainment department. And our lottery people, if they were here, they'd say call it Wisconsin, because we're a lucky state. Even though we're a medium-sized state, we're always in the top 10 in terms of winners. So there's a lot of elements to it, state and local finance. We work with all 1,840 municipalities. And so it's remarkable what you can attain to help people. And fortunately, the governor, being a former superintendent of schools, is very sensitive for people with disabilities and for children's needs. So we've had increased tax credits for people for child care services and for caregiving for people with disabilities. And so we've been able to kind of move the envelope and through the tax code try to make it better for people on those accounts, as well as focusing tax relief for the middle class.
Do you think that the Department of Revenue, under your stewardship, has been more active than, generally speaking, that the department might be?
I think my team would tell you probably more active than ever before. Now, I have to say this, though. I mean, I inherited a good department. Rick Chandler, who was the secretary prior to me, is a Republican, Secretary of Revenue. We're good friends. We've been friends for 20 years. He was helpful. Roger Irvin, who was a Democratic secretary under Governor Doyle. I brought all the former living secretaries together last summer in order to talk about sort of both the strengths of the department and where we might want to go. So I think we have a good team of people that truly care about our customers and work hard every day. So I'd like to think we maybe have improved it and made it a little bit more customer friendly and done a little bit more outreach. But I have to say I truly inherited a good department, and I'm proud to be at the leadership there, along with a wonderful senior leadership team that works hard every week.
Okay, and what is the role of yours today as regards to the legislature?
Mm-hmm. Well, I work very closely with the legislature, on any bills that affect the Department of Revenue, and we do the most amount of fiscal notes because, almost every bill has some sort of a fiscal impact. So we put together fiscal notes, and I'm there testifying a lot on bills that, would impact the tax code or impact state and local finance or lottery or things of that sort. And then I work very closely with people in both parties to put together bipartisan legislation. We have a public safety and revenue enforcement bill. I'm working with, one of our local legislators, Senator Van Wangard, who's a former police officer, who's helping to champion that, along with, Dora Drake, who's a Democratic legislator from Milwaukee, and Lena Taylor, and then Chairman John Mockel, who's chairman of the Ways and Means Committee in the Assembly.
And you mentioned just briefly earlier about some bills that have been passed while you have been the Secretary of the Department of Revenue. What did those bills do?
Mm-hmm. Well, a couple that we were very pleased with, like for unclaimed property. And I would encourage everybody to go to our website to see if you have unclaimed property, because even my sister had gotten a couple claims recently, one fairly large one. And it's so easy to, maybe a dividend check came to you or it got sent to the wrong address, and so you've got money sitting there you don't even know about, or maybe your spouse had a bank account that, when you got married, forgot it was even there, and may not be a lot of money, maybe $200 or $300, but every little bit helps in today's economy. So we rewrote that statute. That was very important. We passed a taxpayer enhancement package that made it easier for veterans to qualify for homestead. that came from our VITA programs, where we work with the Association for Retired People and other nonprofits, and in order to provide tax assistance for people. It also made it easier for claiming the historic credit when you're doing redevelopment, like we did here in Kenosha with, for instance, with the Stella Hotel or some of the other historic development that we did. So, we work with some local developers even who brought to us ways that we can make it easier for them to utilize that tax credit. And then also we came up, I like to joke, whoever thought we'd have to thank South Dakota, but they had gotten a court decision on Wayfair, so we put together the marketplace bill to make it easier for small businesses, so that if they're on Etsy or an Amazon site, Amazon and Etsy are responsible for collecting the sales taxes to make it easier on small businesses who maybe don't have the wherewithal to put that together. So things of that sort are just a few of the many, about 5 bills that we did pass on a bipartisan basis last session.
If money comes into the state from the federal government, does the Department of Revenue have any role in what happens to that money, or how does that work?
Right. Well, the Department of Administration plays the largest role, but ironically, they asked us to administer the, most of the largest grant programs. So, like the We're All In Small Business Program, the Wisconsin Tomorrow Small Business, the Wisconsin Farm Support Program, the Hotel and Lodging, the Restaurant Tours Program. We administered all those, and it's remarkable. It was a good thing we did because, having tax information, there were massive fraud attempts. I think there were 70,000 different attempts for people to try and steal that grant money. And because we have tax records, we could see for a lot of these people that applied never paid taxes before. So we would be able to send them a letter. I see you're applying for a grant. Before we can release this information, we have to make sure that you in fact do own this company and that you are registered. And so we were able to save a lot of fraud. In fact, Chairman Mako, complimented us on that, fraud type effort. And so our team really took seriously those efforts. And even though they had to work extremely hard during the pandemic, I think we had 100,000 extra calls and 30,000 extra emails. They were proud to do it because they knew they were helping to make sure, as the governor wanted, that you would have businesses survive at the other end of the pandemic. And in Wisconsin, I'm proud to say, was #1 in the country in returning those federal funds to help small businesses and farms and recreational type businesses to survive.
Okay, and now that you're out of the political arena, so to speak, how do you see the relationship between the political parties and the ability to accomplish goals?
Well, it's harder than it's ever been before, unfortunately. And, and the federal government, I think, is the worst by far. You see where there's just such acrimony. There's even a concern if they're going to meet our national debt obligations, which is unthinkable because, the economic havoc that it would create would be just devastating, really, for our economy and for many business people. On the state level, it's still strained, no question about it. But, despite that, as I indicated, I still get to work with legislators on a regular basis, and we're able to make progress, more than people actually imagine. Because, naturally, the press covers more of the conflict than the cooperation side of the equation, because that's not as interesting to people. I get that. So, but more than you might think, we're still making things happen.
With all of the jobs and positions you've held, what would you say is your most satisfying?
Well, I've been the most blessed guy ever, because every job I've ever had, I felt I could make a difference, and, I enjoyed the work that I was doing. So I've been very fortunate. I think for me, still maybe my favorite job was a friendship camp, just because, like I said, I would have paid to do that job. But really, I have enjoyed every job that I've had. Each one's been a little bit different and a little different focus. But, at the center of it all, I think I was working with people that had a service mentality and wanted to make society just a little bit better where we could.
Any disappointments?
Oh, there's always disappointments, bills you wish you could have passed, you weren't able to get through. I would say my biggest disappointment, though, has been the partisan gerrymandering going on throughout the country by both, Republicans and Democrats, frankly. And it's not right, whoever does it, because, people should pick their their representatives, not politicians picking their voters. So that's been probably the biggest one, that we haven't been able to make progress in that as much as I would like to have seen. The decision on Citizens United, where big money has just way too much of a disproportionate impact on politics. I would say those have been my biggest disappointments. The open meetings law that we took all the way to the Wisconsin Supreme Court when during Act 10 they met without giving the proper notice, and the Supreme Court in essence said, well, the legislature doesn't have to follow the laws because in effect they're vetoing them. Well, the legislature can't veto laws. They can repeal them, but it also takes the governor. So it was a terrible decision in my judgment. And at the center of it, the legislature, when they passed the open meetings and open records laws, they said, hold us accountable. And the Supreme Court didn't do that when the legislature asked them to do that. So those would be the disappointments, but I'm still an optimist. I still believe the pendulum swings, and I think in the end, the people will eventually totally be in charge again. I truly believe we'll get closer to government of the people, by the people, and for the people, which Abraham Lincoln, one of our greatest presidents, reminded us of.
After your serving as Department of Revenue Secretary, what's next?
I have no idea. I've never been a guy that has some master plan that I want to do this and then that. And I really, truly just try to focus on the responsibilities I have and take them to heart, do the best job I can in this position now. I've had the good fortune of being on the IRS Advisory Committee, trying to have them be just a little bit more customer friendly. And it's worked to some degree. Where they used to only be able to answer 15 to 20% of their calls, they're now answering 80%. So that's improvement. And also, I've been the first vice president of our what we call the Federation of Tax Administrators, which is all the revenue departments throughout the country. And good Lord willing, in June, I'll still be here in this fine position, and then I'll be president of that national organization. So I just focus on the job ahead, do the best job I can, and we'll see what might lie ahead. You never know what opportunity might be around the corner.
Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you. Great to be with you. Appreciate the opportunity, Carl, and thanks for the work that you're all doing to compile a great history of this community, which I think is second to none. I just will end on this one point that, I'm glad I was able to get in just a few of the many Kenoshans that played such a role in getting bills passed. I always am amazed when citizens take up that mantle, like Ed O'Makarian working with the veterans groups, or Mary Iverson working with the farm groups, or Edith Simons working with the various people for disabilities in those organizations to help push ahead. I played a role in those, but you know what? I give them the credit because they're the ones that were tenacious and were sort of like the wind beneath my wings. So I think it's a special community that's had a long history of being active and caring about their community and caring about moving forward with politics. It goes back to George Molinaro, who was Speaker of the House, and Joe Andrea, who is probably the most public-centered political leader ever, and so many others. So I'm just honored to be amongst that group and to play our role. Thank you.